This is Asia News Weekly, the podcast featuring news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. Democracy advocates in Hong Kong stand their ground and send a clear message to Beijing. Is China's active defense strategy anything new, and just what does that mean? Plus, was Washington's OPM hack consistent with China's cyber warfare plans? These stories and more next. Hello everyone, welcome to this Friday, June 19th edition of Asia News Weekly. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and it is my pleasure to be here with you, so thank you so kindly for joining me. Now, before we get into this week's news stories, keep in mind that each of the following interviews are available on our website as an individual audio download in the Asia Now podcast feed, as well as the Asia Brief at the end of the podcast. That being said, let's get started. As I have for the past couple of weeks, we're going to kick off the podcast with MERS, and yes, more MERS. Now, there have been a number of updates this past week, but I'm only going to focus on perhaps the most salient bits of information to help paint a comprehensive picture of the current situation in South Korea. Now, first, as of this recording, 23 people have died as a result of contracting MERS. The total number of those diagnosed thus far stands at 165. However, 19 have fully recovered. Of those remaining in care, around 15 remain in unstable condition. Some 6,500 around the country are under quarantine, and at least 80 hospitals have been affected. Here are some other key updates. About 90% of those who have died had pre-existing conditions. Remember, if you are immunocompromised, you are at a higher likelihood of contracting MERS. Over half of all cases have been traced back to Samsung Medical Hospital in Seoul, which has closed most of its operations as it battles the disease. In fact, one patient alone infected at least 60 people at Samsung. The 2-week quarantine period is also being examined, since a few cases seem to have emerged after that period had elapsed. Second, a joint South Korea World Health Organization team criticized the South Korean government for compromising early quarantine measures with its delays in releasing information, essentially throwing the Korean government under the bus, saying that if it had actually released more information sooner, a more manageable system could have been put in place and infections could have been reduced. Now, while I do agree that information should have been more forthcoming, I'm not sure fewer infections could have been guaranteed. The joint report also noted that because families tend to stick together and care for those ill, it allowed for transmission of MERS. The report used the terms healthcare shopping and part of Korean culture. In response, Korean Federation of Medical Groups for Health Rights Policy Committee Chief Woo Suk-young blame structural issues in the South Korean healthcare system, including the need for people to take turns caring for their sick family members because of inadequate healthcare staffing and the tendency of patients to visit large hospitals rather than neighborhood clinics. We're not going to get an institutional solution by simply calling it the culture. Seoul Mayor Park Won-soon is also in some hot water. Prosecutors have opened a probe after the Committee for Innovation of Medical Systems, a doctors' rights group, lodged a complaint against Mayor Park, accusing him of defaming a doctor and inciting fear by publicizing incorrect information. Now, if you recall, Mayor Park said the doctor broke quarantine and possibly infected over 1,500 people during a June 4th press conference. That statement alone, understandably, raised concerns. While we still expect to see some more cases of MERS confirmed, the rate at which they're spreading appears to be decreasing, leading some to believe that things will be sorted out by the end of June or at least the beginning of July. As a result, schools for the most part are back open. More than 85% of those shuttered reopened this past week, with the remaining 15% expected to do so next week, barring anything out of the ordinary this weekend. Many in South Korea are still opting to stay away from large public venues like movie theaters, department stores, or sports stadiums. The decision to reopen schools was really based on a WHO recommendation that noted that infections were still mainly tied to hospitals and not public venues or schools. Another casualty of the MERS outbreak has been South Korea's tourism business. Kim Chol-min with the Ministry of Tourism said that if the trend in visitor cancellations continued throughout the summer, it would mean a loss of over $900 million in expected revenue for the tourism industry. To help promote safe travel in South Korea, the government has added a foreigner helpline available in 19 different languages on the tourism side of things, and the Ministry of Health has also opened a hotline in 4 different languages for people showing symptoms. Furthermore, the government will offer free travel insurance to visitors. The insurance will cover the cost of treatment should one contract MERS while in South Korea. As I have said from the get-go, if you practice good hygiene and are reasonably healthy, then the chances of you contracting MERS is fairly remote. People are slowly coming to that realization, but it may take a long time for South Korea to fully recover from this outbreak. Once we hit a few days with no new cases or deaths announced, we can then expect concern to fade. But until then, people will remain overly cautious, and we'll probably also see a few more salacious headlines. It has been a tumultuous week in Hong Kong as thousands took to the streets ahead of Wednesday's discussion in the Legislative Council to determine the fate of the planned 2017 election for the autonomous region's chief executive. Those in opposition to the so-called Beijing plan gathered in the streets this past weekend voicing their opinion. While numbering far less than the scores of people that occupied the streets in 2014, their voices were heard. Momentum for the movement appeared to have picked up some steam after a televised debate over the weekend. Prior to that event, the South China Morning Post placed the opposition at 49%. After the debate, opposition surged to 54%. But there also appears to be a fair amount of controversy. First, one pro-democracy lawmaker claimed he was offered more than $12 million to change his vote to the government's plan. Then there were also reports that 10 individuals belonging to a fringe group named the National Independence Party apparently tried to make some chemical explosives and detonate the bombs in an attempt to disrupt the voting procedures. Now, that particular narrative is being questioned by many, including scholarism leader Joshua Wong, who called the entire episode a farce. He said, quote, "Even if you wanted to storm the Legislative Council, you wouldn't make explosives to get in. It's not reasonable. No matter who did it, the government successfully vilifies the localists." Now, Ronald Lung, a spokesman for a hardline localist group, also found the idea of making explosives a little suspect, but noted that if the story turned out to be true, demonstrated the level of frustration many in Hong Kong feel. As a result, police took to the streets to stand guard around government buildings should anyone try to storm the legislative complex and disrupt the proceedings. Now, to get the latest on these proceedings, I spoke with Emily Lau, chairperson for the Hong Kong Democratic Party, on the phone this past Thursday morning. Well, first of all, I'm very thankful for you taking this time out to speak with me.
You're welcome.
So I wanted to back things up just a few days and get your opinion about the marches, the protests that came out into the streets. Do you think that the people's voices were heard as they were communicating their desire for universal suffrage?
I don't think the Hong Kong and the central government heard the people's voices, and that's why I call this whole thing a tragedy. And of course, with the vote, which would take place within hours, this tragedy will come to an end, and then we will begin a new chapter of another struggle for democracy. But obviously, the people, the Beijing and the Hong Kong government have not heard the people's demand for democracy.
Leading up to the session that began yesterday, did you see anything that really surprised you? I mean, there were talks of, the bomb plot and at least one legislator being, tempted to be bribed with large sums of money to change his vote. Did you expect these things to take place?
Well, actually, I'm not surprised with anything. And one thing that I heard, I don't know whether it's true or not, is that the people here, maybe in government and others, have misinformed Beijing or informed Beijing that the package could be passed. And in order to do that, of course, they need several votes from the pro-democracy camp. And that was the message that was given to Beijing, that it's possible. And of course, to do that, you need some sweeteners or whatever. So actually, the situation is pretty awful and pretty complicated. So, but I have no evidence whatsoever to show that people are offering money or people are taking money.
Now, you mentioned the swing votes, that 4 votes need to be changed from pro-democracy.
No, more than 4 now.
It's more than 4?
Much more than 4. Because the administration openly admits they only have 41. They need 47 to win.
Okay. So, but are you at all concerned that they could actually achieve that vote and this plan be passed?
Of course I'm concerned, but there isn't that much I can do because these are all human beings and they are independent. They do whatever they want. But publicly, of course, the 28 members all said they will vote against it. But should they go in and vote the other way, then they will have to, of course, explain themselves. But what can I do? They are not members of my party. I do not have any control over them.
Absolutely. What is the general mood there? I mean, what are people experiencing in the Legislative Council?
In the council, of course, we are making accusations at each other. The other side, of course, is blaming us for blocking universal suffrage. And we are saying that we don't want it because it's not genuine universal suffrage. So you know, and it's recrimination. But I think it is not really that hostile or poisonous. But of course, we are unhappy. And with speaking for myself, and I spoke yesterday, I feel very sad and very angry because we've been fighting for democracy for so long, and now we have to vote against a proposal for universal suffrage. And the reason is that it is not genuine universal suffrage, although it's one person, one vote. It is deeply regrettable.
We've already discussed this. If this measure, as it's widely expected, is voted down, vetoed, if you will, the election in 2017 for the chief executive will revert back to its current selection process. Given that the goal is to have universal suffrage in Hong Kong, what do you think needs to take place?
Well, I think we should have a consensus here. That is the ideal situation. And in fact, to move any policy forward, you should have a consensus. That means majority support in the council. And of course, in this case, you need to have the support of Beijing. But if we do have a strong consensus here, it would be easier to persuade Beijing. And but if you can persuade Beijing, then Beijing, of course, can tell the pro-Beijing legislators to support it. But I think it would be good if we can have a consensus here. And unfortunately, because there is so much vested interest, you know, it's going to be a very, very complicated and very, very difficult process.
All right. Emily Lau is the chairperson of the Democratic Party in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Shortly after our conversation, the vote did take place, but not exactly as planned. Pro-package lawmakers actually got up and left the venue, believing that if they did so, they could delay the vote because there wouldn't be sufficient members left in place to hold quorum. That wasn't the case. When the vote was called, 8 voted in favor and 28 in opposition. This means the Beijing plan was vetoed. It was voted down. So where do we go from here? Well, as we have discussed before, there is no vote in the 2017 election for the chief executive. The current method of selection will remain in place, and the progress towards universal suffrage in Hong Kong must now begin anew. So I want to ask you, now that Hong Kong is beginning at square one in its pursuit for universal suffrage, what do you think needs to happen? Last Friday was the Philippines' Independence Day. As one might expect, it was a day marked by celebrations of sovereignty. With China continuing its push in the South China Sea, hundreds took to the streets to protest against Beijing's actions. New Alliance Party Secretary General Renato Reyes said, quote, "We may be a small country, but our people will fight back. We'll stand up against any form of foreign intervention, either by the Chinese or by the United States. We want a truly independent Philippines, one that is not dictated upon or undermined by any foreign power." End quote. U.S. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter also mentioned the situation to visiting General Fan Changlong, Vice Chairman of China's Central Military Commission. In a released Pentagon statement, Carter reiterated U.S. concerns on the South China Sea and called on China and all claimants to implement a lasting halt on land reclamation, cease further militarization, and pursue a peaceful resolution of territorial disputes in accordance with international law. To that end, China's Xinhua news agency released the following last weekend. The rift over the South China Sea between Beijing and Washington has heightened tensions in the region. But dispute over this body of water is only an episode in China-U.S. relations instead of a flashpoint as portrayed or feared by many. Another article also accused Japan of trying to sell its anti-China agenda at the G7 summit for its own selfish interests and purposes, and predicted Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's attempt to forge a unified anti-China stand would be futile. Are these statements by China effectively telling the world to step off? And there's no point in discussing the 9-dash line further. With me on the phone right now is Scott Harold, Deputy Director of the RAND Center for Asia-Pacific Policy and a political scientist at the RAND Corporation, to break things down. Can you in plain terms define what the Chinese are saying by this term active defense that they used in their last white paper? Is it as ominous as it sounds, or is it really just the same thing that they've been doing and really the same thing that other nations are doing?
So the Chinese use the term active defense, which is a translation into English of the Chinese term "jiji fangyu," which literally translates as active defense. The Chinese have been using this term for a long time. It's not really a new term. What we saw a few weeks ago was the issuance of a defense strategy white paper. The Chinese have been issuing defense white papers for a little over 10 years. This is the first time actually it's probably about 15 years now, but this is the first time they've issued a defense strategy paper. The description of the defense strategy paper describing China as having an active defense strategy is really talking about how China is looking to more actively shape the region that they're in, and that their interests and capabilities are expanding, which is why I think the term has gotten increased prominence, and why I think it's probably causing foreign observers to pay a little closer attention. The Chinese are, of course, talking about using their navy and their military capabilities more broadly to protect their interests further and further from China's shores. That's something that is a reflection of the fact that over the last 35 years, China's interests and Chinese people are venturing further and further afield in larger numbers, and therefore China has ever more substantial equities overseas, whether that's in terms of investments or in terms of trade routes that they need to protect or want to protect, or in terms of people who they might feel an obligation to try to rescue in the event that a given country where Chinese people happen to be living or traveling to descends into chaos and they feel the need to extract their nationals. So I think that's part of what's behind this push to describe China's military strategy in somewhat more activist terms.
Well, in terms of this active defense, does this white paper essentially I guess, want to put out there that they're going to connect the 9-dash line to make it a line, a maritime border, and really set apart China's ideological view of the disputed waters to the rest of the world?
You know, China's claims to this 9-dash line originated in 1947 with a map issued by the preceding Chinese government, the Republic of China, which is now Taiwan. And at that time, there were 11 dashes. Now there are 9. One of them was negotiated away. One of them was around Taiwan and is no longer used. But the mainland government has inherited this and has upheld this claim for a very long time without ever specifying what the 9 dashes or 11 dashes mean. In 1992, the National People's Congress, that's China's version of a legislature, passed a law admonishing or entrusting the PLA to defend China's sovereign claims or China's claims, which included the 9-dash line claims. But it's never been made clear whether those dashes are intended to signal that China is claiming simply the land features or the physical or the sum total of the waters that would fall within those. And of course, those dashes appear as vague lines on a map. They do not correspond to anything that is marked at sea, so no one has any idea exactly where they fall. The Chinese will often talk about having something like 3 million square kilometers of territorial waters, and the only way you get to that number is if you include these very substantial claims in the South China Sea as territorial waters. However, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will never come out and specify what it means. Of course, your listeners, Steve, know that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China is actually one of the weakest ministries in that country. It actually is charged largely with executing or representing foreign and diplomatic policy, not with actively making it. So what those dashes correspond to, what they imply about what falls within their boundaries, is something that China has historically been highly reluctant to specify or clarify, in part because it's largely or widely believed that what falls within those could not credibly be claimed by China on any basis other than its own word and its description of these things as inherited from history. So it is a case that I think the Chinese are looking to avoid having to clarify their 9-dash line claim, whether by use of the active defense strategy, which I don't think directly corresponds to the claims in any way, in any particular way, or through any kind of diplomatic clarification, because they would like to hold off as long as possible having to clarify that until they have the material capabilities to simply present the region with a fait accompli. And I think that's why China's artificial island building in the South China Sea has been so disturbing and destabilizing to the region, because so many actors in that region are hoping that China will do what it said it would do in 2002, and that is agree not to take destabilizing steps and to bind itself, and then to go a step further and bind itself under international arbitration and make its claims conform to international law.
Right, and we've been talking a lot about what's been taking place in the sea, the land reclamation, and they're asserting that it's their sovereign territory. Some have also speculated that China may also announce an ADIZ, an Air Defense Identification Zone, over the South China Sea as it did in the East China Sea. Has there been anything in this last defense strategy white paper that would give an inkling as to what they may do?
I don't think it comes so much from the defense strategy white paper as from some of the statements that the Chinese officials and that unofficial but close to the government Chinese have said. The Chinese government has stated that officially it has no intention or no plans to announce an ADIZ. But unofficially, people who are often seen as having very close connections to the government say, that's certainly within our right, and we could do that at any time if the situation warrants it. And I think that's probably where China is right now. They recognize that they are deeply unpopular with the region for their actions, and they're trying to decide what's the right timing to announce this move. If they try to announce an ADIZ over the South China Sea, we already saw how destabilizing it was when they tried to do that over the East China Sea. Nowadays, almost no one views that as having had any substantial implications for strengthening China's claim, and it clearly strengthened the U.S.-Japan alliance and turned a number of countries in the region much more skeptical or hostile to China and less trusting of it. And I think the question now is, how many costs or what level of cost are they willing to bear in the South China Sea, and how are trends in that area unfolding? So I think it's certainly something they're holding as a card in their pocket that they could play. But first, I suspect they will want to complete the capabilities that would be required to actually try to engage in the monitoring and potential enforcement of such an ADIZ. And that, of course, requires them to complete the build-out of the artificial islands.
All right, one last question. Over the Shangri-La dialogue, China basically said that this is our sovereign territory. Everybody else has it wrong. This is ours. Is there any way still to move forward with diplomatic solutions? Is talking things out still an option?
Talking things out is certainly still an option if the Chinese were to decide that they want to avail themselves of the international tribunals that exist to arbitrate such disputes. Other large countries like India have availed themselves of this in the past. China itself has in the past submitted to arbitration on other issues. For example, its participation in the WTO is based on the submission of facts-based evidence in support of an argument, and then an international tribunal decides whether or not the facts submitted by one side or the other side, the Chinese side, is more credible. So it's certainly up to China to do that, but if the Chinese side decides that it does not want to do that, they're essentially opting to put themselves outside of the norms for dispute resolution, peaceful dispute resolution. And if they choose to ignore a ruling from an international tribunal, that will have a very destabilizing effect and deleterious impact on their own regional image.
All right, Scott Harrell, Deputy Director of the RAND Center for Asia-Pacific Policy and Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Steve.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. Has the time to talk things out with China passed? Can a diplomatic solution still be achieved? Please let me know. I briefly mentioned the cyber attack on the United States Office of Personnel Management in last week's podcast. Some are calling this cyber attack unprecedented. To help put things into perspective and what it could mean for the Asia-Pacific region, I'm now joined on the phone by Martin Libicki, a senior management scientist at the RAND Corporation. So, this cyber attack on the Office of Personnel Management is being painted as something that's unprecedented. I was wondering if you could really paint a general picture of how bad this attack was.
Well, in terms of sheer numbers, smaller than J.P. Morgan, smaller than Target, smaller than Heartland Payment Systems, probably smaller than Home Depot. But they collected a lot more information per person. Okay. The reports say 4 million. Other people say 14 million because they might have had a lot of other things. There's indications that they compromised SF-86 forms, which are the forms you filled out to get security clearances, and those things can be painfully detailed, having filled out a few.
Okay, now here's where we start getting into, I guess, the cybersecurity aspect of it. Now, the released information thus far has put the origin of the attack inside China. It hasn't been confirmed that it was Beijing, but I wanted to get your opinion on this. Is this kind of cyber attack consistent with the active defense strategy that China talks about in its defense strategy white papers?
It's not inconsistent, but I don't think it has anything to do with it. I mean, from what I understand, China's trying to recruit human spies, and they decided to go about doing it by doing a huge data dump of government workers. They went after health records, or it appears to be the same people who went after health records. It appears to be they went after USIS, which is a company that does security clearances. It all fits together as being very consistent. And by the way, it's not the kind of cyber espionage that we've been banging the Chinese over the head about. The United States would like to promulgate the norm that national security espionage is what countries do, but stealing intellectual property is a no-no. We don't do it, and our friends do it, is our argument. But this is clearly not an intellectual property case. It's a national security case.
Oh, exactly. Now, if this is determined to be a state-sponsored event, what is the appropriate response for the United States?
Fire the head of OPM?
Just that? Just get rid of the head?
Well, it's like this, okay? What if we're going to basically say that we don't punish nations for doing national security espionage because we do it ourselves? It doesn't kind of work for us to start saying, this bothers me because it's national security espionage. And yes, we do it, but we're big and you're small and we're going to punish you anyway, right? When you're big and the other guys are small, you can punish them for things that you yourself do. And you can get away with it because you're big. But China's not small anymore. So the administration has formally not called China out on this. And the administration has not been talking about reprisals either for this, okay? Even though there are rumors that the executive order signed several months ago to put named individuals under some sort of U.S. sanctions is being mooted for this case. You have to sometimes make a distinction between those things that are in a country's capability ambit and those are not, okay? If the United States wished to deny visas for everybody whose name began with the letter A, it is perfectly within the U.S. rights to do so. Now, other countries may respond likewise, but if it's a country that we don't want to visit, but we're a country that they want to visit, we have an asymmetric advantage, okay? By the same token, because the United States is the desirable place to go and be educated, and because we still have a great deal of influence over the banking system in this world, we can do things which are in our sovereign power that give us an asymmetric advantage. In other words, if we deny Chinese corporations access to U.S. financing, it's going to hurt a lot more than if China denies U.S. corporations access to Chinese financing. But in the long run, you have to ask yourself the question, are we always going to be in this asymmetric position? And are we establishing precedents that are going to come back and bite us? So the question is what's legal and illegal, or what we have the right to do and don't have the right to do. The question is, what is the wisdom of embarking on a particular course?
Sage advice. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, good luck.
Well, what do you think should happen? Should we just chalk it up to normal cyber espionage and that the United States got caught with their pants down? Or should more stringent measures be taken in retaliation to those who carried out the attack? Please let me know in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. It is time once more for the Asia Brief, a collection of stories from the Asia-Pacific region you may have missed. Coming up, some say ISIS is winning the war on some fronts, the DPRK shoots some missiles, confirms a purge, and loses a conscript. These stories plus more next. Kicking things off for this week ending June 19, we turn our attention to the world's cancer, the Islamic State. In just 3 years, ISIS has managed to bring together more than double the number of people of its predecessor, Al-Qaeda, did in 10 years. Singapore Defense Minister Ng Eng Hen dropped that little nugget of information before saying things may actually get worse with ISIS before they get better. Then he also noted that even if ISIS was destroyed, another group may rise up in its place. Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott echoed those thoughts, saying more must be done to combat the Islamic State's group's global ambitions and in the organization's mass appeal. Using an alternative name for the group, he said, Daesh is coming, if it can, for every person and for every government with a simple message, submit or die. The declaration of a caliphate, preposterous though it seems, is a brazen claim to universal domination. Now, you can't negotiate with an entity like this, you can only fight it. But the fight may not be going all that well. According to an internal U.S. State Department assessment of the Islamic State's propaganda machine printed in the New York Times, the assessment concluded the Islamic State's violent narrative, promulgated through thousands of messages each day, has effectively trumped the efforts of some of the world's richest and most technologically advanced nations. Keep in mind, information is power, And what those opposed to ISIS need to do is to do more than just attack physical targets. They need to zap the source of ISIS's power: hatred. Last week I mentioned that reports came in that it appeared that a boat carrying 65 migrants, including children and a pregnant woman, was paid by an Australian Navy vessel to return to Indonesian waters. Police looking into the matter said the crew were each paid 5,000 Australian dollars to turn back. Prime Minister Tony Abbott refused to deny these reports, saying that Australia had developed, quote, incredibly creative approaches to stop asylum boats from reaching Australia. The BBC's John Donaldson noted Abbott may be using financial means to meet his pledge to stop the boats. His claim that Australia was doing so by hook or by crook indicates that he knows such methods stretch ethical boundaries. Human rights groups deplore the policies, but they have been effective in reducing the number of people coming ashore in Australia. Indonesia's Vice President, Yusuf Kala, said the practice of paying boats to turn away could be equated to state-sponsored human trafficking. Australia's Foreign Minister Julie Bishop responded by saying the best way to resolve any concerns was for Indonesia to secure its own borders. North Korea has been quiet of late, so you know what that means. Yep, time to shoot some missiles. Earlier this week, Kim Jong-un watched two drills featuring what North Korean media called a new type of anti-ship rockets. One of the drills took place during the day and featured anti-ship rockets. The other was held at night, testing both ground artillery and warships. The newspaper described the rockets as highly intelligent, that detected and hit enemy warships in the drill, and reported that Kim appreciated their high concentrated firing and apparently remarked that the shells seemed to have eyes. Now, those weren't the only military drills and tests carried out by the DPRK last week. Last Sunday, North Korea reportedly fired 3 KN-01 missiles off their east coast. Also on the news from North Korea, South Korean news outlet YTN reported confirmation that former Defense Minister Hyun Yong-chol had been purged. The report does seem valid, as Kim Jong-un was seen with Pak Yong-sik, the country's new defense chief, at a recent military event. And finally, a tale of courage. Monday, a 19-year-old North Korean enlistee defected to South Korea. He told investigators that he made the decision after suffering from chronic assaults in the military. He began his trek on June 7th, using vehicles or marching on foot before he was able to cross the military demarcation line. The Joint Chiefs of Staff said, quote, after staying overnight near our guard post inside the demilitarized zone, the soldier was first spotted by our service members on patrol at around 7:55 a.m. He right away expressed his will to defect, and we secured the man. Responding to criticism about the young man being able to enter South Korea through the most heavily fortified border in the world, the Joint Chiefs of Staff replied, quote, it was foggy, and the border area was thick in the woods, which effectively obstructed our view, end quote. Now, when you think about it, that really isn't the best of excuses. 2015 not only marks the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, but also the 50th anniversary of normalized relations between South Korea and Japan. Now, while South Korea's Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se will visit Tokyo this coming weekend to meet with his Japanese counterpart on mending ties, the reality of the situation is that simply won't be possible under the current administrations. Yes, the two nations can and will continue to work together on several fronts, but fostering close ties just isn't in the cards, and we saw more examples of that this week. First, South Korea continued its international push to derail Japan's plan to list several industrial facilities as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. South Korea, also backed by China, is strongly opposed to the Japanese move, arguing that some of the candidate sites used Koreans as forced laborers during the 1940s and that information should be clearly listed if the sites are approved or preferably rejected. Then there was this quote from South Korean President Park Geun-hye. There has been considerable progress on the issue of the comfort women, and we are in the final stage of our negotiations, so I think we can expect to look forward to a very meaningful 50th anniversary of the normalization of our diplomatic ties. No. Japan has consistently made its position clear that the matter was settled with the bilateral treaty in 1965 and correctly called out President Park for trying to exude pressure on Japan. Tomomi Inada, someone close to the Abe administration, told Reuters News, quote, "The Prime Minister has repeatedly said that the comfort woman system was a violation of the woman's human rights and that it was extremely regrettable. I think the anniversary statement will be formulated based on that premise." That was further expanded upon by another Japanese source quoted in Yonhap News. Quote, "The only way to resolve this issue will be for South Korea to adjust the mark and lower its expectations." End quote. Now, as I mentioned last week, until it becomes politically advantageous for Abe and the LDP to change their tune, they won't. Seoul is simply spinning its wheels. Thailand's junta is continuing its clampdown on free speech in the kingdom, the latest victim, the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. The Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand had planned on hosting a panel discussion this past Wednesday on the nation's controversial lèse-majesté law. Anyone convicted of defaming, insulting, or threatening the king, queen, heir, or regent faces up to 15 years in prison on each count, making it one of the strictest punishments in the world for such an offense. The group received a letter saying that if the event went ahead, the military would come in and seal off access to the building where the club was located. Thus, the group made the decision to cancel the discussion. It was the second such time the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand had been told to cancel an event. The first was when they planned to discuss human rights earlier this month. Finally, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or the MILF, retired dozens of fighters and handed over a batch of assault weapons to the government as part of a ceremonial show of commitment towards a stalled peace deal. The weapons included 75 firearms, mortars, and rocket launchers. Some 145 guerrilla fighters also reportedly retired into civilian life. What we are witnessing today is a solid testament to the unreserved and honest participation of the MILF in our peace talks and of their preparedness to abandon the path of violence, said Philippine President Aquino. Both sides hope that this good show of faith will help Philippine lawmakers fulfill another part of the peace deal, approve legislation granting formal autonomy to the mostly Muslim southern region of the nation. Earlier this month, the lawmakers failed to pass the Bangsamoro Basic Law because of the MILF involvement in a botched police raid that left 44 officers dead in January. Now, this basic law does need to be passed so that both sides can effectively work together and root out trouble in the region. Well, here we are once more, my friends, at the end of the podcast. Now, before I go, let's take a look at some of your comments from this past week. First up, Stump Jumper. Good interview. I think since it is large companies that benefit the most from these institutions, they should have a large role in funding them. Why should taxpayers fund what is essentially a pool of profits for them? It will be interesting to see how the AIIB develops over time. Hyung Chol Kim says, thanks, always insightful. Teresa Chin says, first time I've heard of an immigration official paying off boat drivers. I don't think it's exactly the right way to do things, but I'm pro turning back boats. Too much human trafficking going on, and until current refugees start integrating and being more productive members of society, I really don't want to be paying for them to stay. As terrible as that may sound, Australia has plenty of local people who are in need. Anthony Murphy says, I feel as though Article 9 needs to be amended. I am, however, very hesitant to say that due to the very real possibility of Abe's sharks sparking something in the Pacific region. Also, China, who recently watched Russia in Crimea and is pulling the same kind of crap, might use it as an excuse to do something really stupid. Humor said, the reason the United States and Japan did not join the AIIB was not because they are against the idea of a development bank, but rather AIIB is controlled by Chinese Communist Party, who are currently conducting a full cyber war with the United States and invading the South China Sea. Red White Dude says, Perhaps she thought that Korea is the same country that her father left her. Heavy-handed control of information. Joaquin Menchaca said, on white hat hackers being underpaid, hacking should be encouraged and directed toward legal activities. But then again, in the United States, it seems gaining real knowledge in any category is discouraged, as it threatens the power structures in place. Tim Siebert said, there is a similar problem here, and not just from pay. In many states, it's a harsher punishment to be a hacker than it is to be a murderer. Why would anyone even bother to enter the technology field when the talent is treated subpar and is underpaid for the total hours worked? And finally, Glove Design via Twitter on a joint US-China deal. No, the deal will give all our military secrets to China. They will then attack us. Thanks again for all your comments this week. I truly do value them, and as always, I hope you'll take a moment this week to share your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. If you enjoyed this week's podcast, please share with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. When you subscribe, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. You can subscribe on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application. Now, to keep up with more news from the region, be sure to follow Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And if you have a comment, a question, or some feedback about the show, please shoot me an email message. That email address is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. Well, that's all the time I have for this week. Thank you so much for joining me. And until next time, my name is Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.